Right, thanks very much to everyone for joining this afternoon. Or it's afternoon here in South Africa, should I rather say. I know it might be quite early in the morning for a lot of you around the world. Some of you, it's a little bit later in the evening as well. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to me. Um, so we're going to chat about mastering exposure. And in the little presentation that I'm going to show you guys now, I'm going to start fairly basic. But it's all the basis of where I'm trying to get to, basically. So many of the stuff that you may be familiar with. For those of you who are just starting in wildlife photography or digital photography, obviously there'll be a lot more to learn for you guys. For the others, it'll be stuff that you're fairly familiar with, but there are certain things that are that I think might make a little bit more sense to you once I explain it. And then also, there's a few misconceptions as well with regards to certain things we're going to chat about with regards to exposure and how everything works. So I'm going to give you my ideas, the way that I shoot, and basically the things that really have worked for me for many years over the past, leading safaris and teaching people about photography. So let's carry on. All right, ladies and gents. So mastering exposure. So basically, a photograph's exposure determines how light or how dark that image is actually going to be once you've captured it. Okay. And as many of you will be familiar with, um, there's three elements that our camera uses in order to expose this and in order to get this correct. And that is our aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, which is very often referred to as the exposure triangle. And mastering these three things and understanding what they do is critical to obviously getting your exposure right. So let's just have a quick look at exposure triangle. I'm pretty sure that many of you have seen an exposure triangle before. So if we look at it as a triangle or a tripod, for example, we have our aperture, our ISO, and our shutter speed. And each one of those obviously affects images in different ways. Our aperture obviously controls depth of field as well as allows in light, depending on what aperture you're photographing. So obviously our lower aperture is f2.8, a lot more light is allowed into the camera, but it's a much shallower depth of field. There's less detail in the image. Higher apertures, more detail, less light. Shutter speed, obviously faster shutter speeds are required in order to get nice sharp images and nice frozen images, so I rather say, to freeze action and that sort of thing. And then slower shutter speeds in order to emphasize motion, or you may end up with blurry images. So 9 times out of 10, if you end up with blurry images, it's because your shutter speed is too slow. That is the biggest cause of images that are blurry. Then ISO obviously regulates the sensitivity of our sensor to light. Okay, so but the downside of this is that the more sensitive we make it to light, the grainier those images become. So the noisier they become. They get like this snowy kind of look and that sort of thing. I don't want to spend too much time going through the actual, what exactly is ISO and aperture and shutter speed. Because I think everyone has a fairly good idea of what they do. But I do have a really nice analysis with regards to how you can a little bit more understand how each one of these things work and how it's relative to a photography, in a little story, should I rather call it that. Okay. So achieving the correct exposure is a lot like collecting rain in a bucket. We can't control how much rain is falling, okay? But there are three factors that we can control. We can control the diameter of the bucket that we use in order to capture that rain, okay? We can control how long we leave that rain, the bucket out there in the rain, okay, in order to collect it. All right, um, and you also don't want to leave it out there for too long. Okay, um, so if you leave it out there too long, you end up with an image that's overexposed. If you leave it out there for not long enough, you end up with an image that's underexposed. So, in other words, from a light perspective, okay, if we don't allow enough light into our camera, we end up with an image that's too dark. If we allow too much light into our camera, we end up with an image that's overexposed. Okay. And a lot of this is if we use the rainfall analysis, we can't control that rainfall. Okay, we can't control the amount of rainfall that is coming. Much the same way in a photography scenario, we can't control how much light there is that's coming out there. Okay, so we need to take control over those three aspects: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, in order to get a correct exposure. Now, many of us will be photographing not necessarily in manual mode, and I'm not advocating that we need to shoot in manual mode. There are certain scenarios where shooting in manual mode is beneficial if you're really trying to take full control over whatever is happening. However, very often we're photographing at times of the day where, or scenarios and scenes in front of us where there's a lot of action and there's a lot of dynamic changing. The animal might be in the shade, it might be in the light, and then shade again, and then light again, and there's a lot of changes that are happening. We can't adjust to these fast enough when we're photographing in manual mode, or in a full manual mode, and we're adjusting all three elements. So very often we are photographing in an aperture priority mode or an aperture mode, in which case we're taking control over our aperture setting, and using that to control the amount of light that's coming in as well as the depth of field. We're also taking control of our ISO, which we're using largely in order to make sure that we're getting enough shutter speed, okay, and that we're not ending up with blurry photographs. So that's very, very important. So very often we may also be shooting manual auto ISO is another way that is very commonly photographed. But the point is, of those three elements, we are taking control of two of them, and the camera is setting the third element, whether it be setting your shutter speed, or whether it be setting your ISO, or whether it be setting your aperture, depending on what mode you're photographing in. The camera is making a calculation in order to set one of those parameters. And this method of shooting is obviously a lot easier and a lot more controllable from a perspective of photographing a scene that's very dynamic, that's changing all the time. So it's very, very a really good way to photograph rather than just shooting in manual and trying to take over all three elements. Some people do it and they do it very successfully. Others try to do it, and it's just too much to do. So I really do advocate using one of the other program modes like aperture priority or manual auto ISO or shutter priority, depending on what you're photographing and what your scene best relies on in order for you to photograph it in a really accurate manner. So when we look at exposure, and we've now discussed that our camera is trying to, let's say, for example, I think aperture priority, I think most people, or a lot of people around the world, photograph in aperture priority. Okay. So if we take into account that we're photographing aperture priority, and I'm going to talk as if we are photographing an aperture priority going forward, our camera has a target exposure. So it has an idea of what it is trying to expose for. So when the camera is pointed at a subject, it's there and it's saying, okay, well, how do I calculate what the correct exposure is? And this is through a very clever system. So each one of our cameras has a built-in light meter, which it uses to make calculations of available settings. So depending on what it has available to you, okay. So it uses that light meter in order to read a light together with whichever metering mode you have decided to use. Okay, is where it's going to read that light from. Is it going to evaluate the entire scene or matrix metering, or is it going to evaluate a very small area, as if you're using spot metering, for example, which would only evaluate probably in the region of about 5 to 8% of your image, is where it's going to read that light from. So depending on what metering mode you're using, the camera is still evaluating whatever you're pointing it at in order for it to try and make a calculation. However, these light meters have one major flaw, and that they only read reflected light. Okay, so in other words, they require light to bounce off a subject and reflect back into the camera's metering system in order for it to try and calculate how much light is coming off that subject. So now, if all subjects that we photograph reflected the same amount of light, this would work 100% perfect and there would be no issues whatsoever. However, in the real world, each subject, each color tone, each tone of gray and brown and red and blue and everything reflects a different amount of light depending on how luminant it is. Okay, so therefore our cameras are standardized to a certain criteria, and that would be the reflective of luminance coming off an 18% gray subject. This may not necessarily be something that's specifically 18% gray, okay, as in the color gray, but it's an 18% reflective tone, okay. So it's an 18% luminance, should I rather say, to explain it that. So in other words, every color within the entire spectrum, if we just use our RGB color values just to start off with, our red, green, and blue, there is an 18% color of each one of those that reflects 18% luminance. Okay, so depending on how bright or how dark it is, it reflects a certain amount of luminance. So our cameras are built to be standardized at about 18% luminance. However, each camera brand is slightly different, and we tend to find that most of this tends to be somewhere between probably in the region of about 12 to about 20% luminance, as each camera manufacturer is different. And the way you can see this is that, so Nikon cameras typically tend to, or many of the Nikon cameras, I don't want to say all of them, many of them tend to slightly overexpose an image naturally, whereas so many of the Canon cameras, if I just talk about those two brands for the time being, many of the Canon cameras tend to underexpose an image very slightly. And when I say underexpose and overexpose, I'm meaning fractionally. In other words, if you take a camera with similar megapixels and a similar lens and point it towards the same subject, and you do the same one with Nikon and one with Canon, you'll notice that in aperture mode that there'll probably be about a third of a stop difference from a shutter speed that the camera calculates. Canon will probably be about a third of a stop faster shutter speed than that of a Nikon, because the Canon is slightly underexposing and Nikon slightly overexposing. Neither one is 100% correct. You will still probably need to make adjustments, which we'll chat about in a little bit, but it just gives you an idea that each metering mode and metering system built into the cameras is not 100% 18% gray. And this is what an 18% luminance gray kind of looks like. But like I was saying, there's an 18% luminance of every color. And that is where our camera is set in order to try and read the light from. That is its target value with regards to how it really wants to expose and try and choose the correct exposure. So if the camera is directly aimed at a subject and this subject is either light or darker than our mid-tone gray or our 18% luminance color tone, the light meter is obviously going to create an error in doing this. So if a subject is brighter, it's going to try and make that to like a slightly darker sort of grayish sort of color. If the subject is darker than our 18% luminance, it's going to try and make it brighter than what it actually is. And if we use a wall as an example, if we're photographing a pure white wall, okay, the camera is going to underexpose it because its target value is this 18% gray, or this sort of gray tone. All right. So it's going to look at this big white wall and say, wow, this white wall is really, really, really bright. And we feel that it's too bright, and we are programmed to try and get this sort of exposure, and it's going to make that wall slightly darker. The same way as it would do with a black wall. If you photograph a very dark wall or very black wall, it's going to make that wall like a sort of grayish sort of color, or not necessarily make it from black to gray, but it's going to make it lighter than what it actually is. Okay. So you can use this for example, if we put this into a real world explanation, if you're photographing in a snowy environment, okay, and it's snowing, your camera is going to look at the snow and it's going to say, wow, there's a whole lot of whiteness going on out here. We're going to underexpose this slightly naturally, which means that you're going to end up with snow that's looking like a grayish sort of horrible color, which is not really what you want. You want to keep it really nice and white. On the dark side, if you're photographing elephants and rhino and buffalo, those sort of animals that have more of a darker texture to their skin, especially like elephants and that sort of stuff, when they're wet and it's rained, they've got this really dark texture to their skin. The camera, again, is going to want to make that lighter than what it actually is. So very often you're going to want to adapt to these kind of scenarios in order to try and make that as accurate as possible. So we said we're going to need to adapt to this, and we're going to try and change this in one way or another to try and get it correct. So now our camera is trying to make something that's light, it's going to try and make it darker, and something that's dark is going to try and make us lighter. So what are we going to use in order to try and correct this? And that is our exposure compensation. So all of our cameras have an exposure compensation button, and this allows us now to be able to say, okay, yes, I understand what you as a camera are trying to do, and that's why it's really important to understand that as a basis, and to know that when you point your camera at something, to have a really good idea of what your camera is going to do with that scene from an exposure perspective. Okay. So we're going to use our exposure compensation now to try and rectify that error that the light meter has made inside our camera. So we can take that snowy scenario and we can use our exposure compensation and go plus a third or plus 2/3 or plus a full stop, whatever it might be, in order to try and keep that snow nice and white. The same way as with the really nice dark elephant, we can say, okay, right, well, I know that the camera is now going to take the scene and it's going to try and make the scene dark or brighter than what it actually is. So I'm going to take my exposure compensation now and I'm going to underexpose this slightly. And either by a third or 2/3, whatever it might have to be, it's also relative to how big that animal is in your frame and what's happening in the background. It's not just your subject. So if you're using a metering mode like evaluative metering or matrix metering, your camera is evaluating the entire scene. So if you're photographing an animal in its environment and you say, yeah, okay, but my animal is really bright and I might need to overexpose it, it's more because the animal's so small in your frame, you actually need to take into consideration more what's happening in the background. So if your background's really bright or if your background's really dark, you're going to have to compensate for that and try and get the subject right within that sort of environment. If you're filling the frame with a subject and it's a portrait shot or it's a really big elephant in your frame and it's filling most of your frame, then you can concentrate more on the subject alone and almost ignore what's happening in the background. But our exposure compensation, much the same way as we can see in this photograph, on the plus side, it's going to make the image slightly brighter, and on the dark side, it's going to make it slightly darker. So if we go minus, it's going to make the image darker, which is what we want to do with really dark subjects. So our elephants, buffalo, and those sort of things, very often we might want to underexpose them very slightly, okay? And with our very bright subjects in very bright environments, shall I rather say, is you may want to overexpose slightly in order to get the correct exposure that you're looking for. All right, or to rather try and avoid what is happening um, in what the camera is doing to that color tone, to try and get it as accurate as possible, shall I rather say. All right. So here's just a couple of examples of that exactly. So here, 3 stops underexposed, very background, light on the subject. Camera picks up this very dark background and says, well, hang on, I'm going to make this even brighter. Now, together with the light that's shining on the subject, if it makes it brighter, it's going to make that subject even more brighter than what's happening, than what it actually already is, which means that you're going to end up with a blown out subject. So here, having to expose by -3 stops, which is quite extreme, at least still gets the correct exposure and gets the correct light on that subject, and you maintain that really nice backlight image, or really nice dark background, should I rather say, that's been created by shining a spotlight on the subject itself. So if you have a scene like this, where it's almost like 50-50, you got 50% sky, you got 50% foreground and everything, but your subject's lying down in the foreground and it's got a little bit of shade in that area. Your camera is going to pick up that bright sky as well. It's going to say, well, there's a really big portion of this image that's really bright, and I need to make that darker. But what's that going to do to the area where your subject is in the shade? It's also going to make that area even darker. So you need to overexpose in order to keep that sky as bright as it is, because very often your camera is going to want to make that sky darker than what actually is. So if you overexpose to keep that sky correct, as you can see in this image, I think that blue is fairly accurate as to what the sky was at that point in time. It also makes sure that you end up with the correct exposure and maybe just a slightly brighter exposure in those shadowed areas where your animal is in the foreground. Obviously, if you have really deep shadows and really bright backgrounds, you're not going to be able to do this. So this is more soft shadows and a fairly bright background. If it becomes too dark, obviously, then you're going to have to make a choice. You're not going to be able to keep your foreground and your sky in the image. You're going to end up having to overexpose to the point where you start losing your sky, or you start blowing out the sky, which very often is the case, where you just have to in order to get your subject correctly exposed. And we'll have a look at some of those images a little bit later on as well. But just another example as well. So white bird, okay, so it's fairly bright, but our cameras, the bird's fairly small in the frame. The water that's surrounding the bird is way darker than what the bird is, okay, which means that if the camera wants to now try and make this dark watered area brighter, it's going to make our white bird even brighter as well, which means we're going to end up blowing out details on our bird. So having to underexpose the scene and maintain the nice dark colors in the water and nice dark tones in the water also helps us to maintain the white on the bird and not blow out to those highlights and those whites that are on our bird that we have there. Elephants, this is actually just after a rain. You can see they're really nice, dark and textured, but we've got this really nice bright grass around it, and the camera obviously picks up this bright grass together with the elephants and tries to average everything out, so just underexposing very slightly, as you can see here, just helps to keep those really nice dark tones that we have in our elephants. This thing just maintains all that nice texture that they really have there. To the an expert perspective, understanding how camera makes or calculate exposure, what it uses to calculate exposure, and how we can utilize exposure compensation, which is the most common method of trying to correct the exposure that our camera is programmed to do on its own. Okay, it's by no means 100% accurate by any means of the way, and that's something that's really, really important to understand. So once we've understood that and how we can rectify that, that brings us to the next thing, which very often provides a little bit of confusion, which is the histogram. Okay, so many people look at a histogram and completely misinterpret what that histogram is telling you, or they're incorrectly using the histogram in certain ways. Okay, so it's a very, very important piece of information that the camera can display to you once you've taken a photograph. But it's also really important to understand how to read a histogram and how to interpret what it's actually telling you. Okay, this image over here, and if we break it down and make it just a little bit simpler, and we convert it into shadows, midtones, and highlights. If we look at our histogram, so right down at the bottom where it says tonal range, from left to right at the bottom of the histogram, that is exactly that. It's tonal range. So in other words, if you have a histogram that goes right from the bottom left-hand corner right through to the bottom right-hand corner, you have a full tonal range, which is great. Okay. It's not wrong if it doesn't reach all the way to the corners. Okay. You may be photographing a scene that, is slightly in from the left-hand side, slightly in from the right-hand side, and you've still got a really nice peak in it, or whatever it might be, or whatever the shape of the histogram might be, but it doesn't reach the left and right edges. That just means that you're photographing a time of the day where there isn't a lot of contrast around. So your image is probably looking a little bit flat. This can be due to you photographing a misty environment, a very dusty environment with lots of dust around and everything like that. Animals running, and there's these big puffs of dust everywhere. And your camera is going to pick those up, and it's going to say, well, these images is fairly flat, and they're not very high contrasted images, or there isn't a lot of contrast in them. So it's going to pull in those edges a little bit, which just means that you don't have a full tonal range, which is very easy to fix in your post-processing. So it's not a target that you need to be looking for, in other words, to have a full tonal range. If light allows it, you'll end up with a full tonal range. If the light doesn't allow it, you won't end up with a full tonal range. And it's not the end of the world that you don't. If we have a look at the histogram from an up and down perspective, okay, it's telling us how many pixels within our range has that color tone. So if we look at this histogram, so this histogram is telling us that there are a lot of information in our shadowed areas. So this section that we have over here, okay. So in that section there, it's telling us there's a very large amount of pixels that have a really dark area, okay. But it's also telling us that in our midtone area over here, there's also a really large amount of pixels that has a lot of midtone area, and there's a very small amount of pixels that have a very bright or highlighted area. Okay, so this histogram is looking pretty good if you interpret it the way that I have now said. So it's telling us where the light is lying, and when you relate this to a photograph, which we'll have as well. However, now that we understand, left to right is obviously our tonal range, up and down is the amount of pixels that it has within that color range. Okay, so it tells us where the light is lying in our image. We need to interpret that in a certain manner of being, yes, this is what I'm happy with, or yes, I understand what the histogram is telling me, but I'm happy with how it's coming out. So many of us have been taught to try and look for this perfect kind of histogram that we have here. Okay, that many people don't think when they've been taught the perfect kind of histogram, if we want to call it that way, is that this is the perfect histogram, the absolute perfect lighting conditions that we could ever wish for. Okay. When everything comes together, the environment is perfect, it's located, everything is 100% right. Yes, this is the perfect histogram. In reality, that doesn't happen very often. So you end up with very oddly shaped histograms that have some sky, some shadow, some midtone, some dark areas, some highlighted areas, histograms that don't necessarily have one peak. Like this histogram that we saw previously, there isn't just one peak in this histogram, so that doesn't make it wrong. So that's the important thing to remember. It's just telling us where that light is lying. So to end up with a perfect histogram like this doesn't happen very, very often. So we need to learn how to interpret what a histogram is telling us, and realize that when we interpret it, is it correctly telling us what's going on in that scene? And is the image that's coming out correctly exposed relative to what the histogram is telling us? So if we have a look at a few examples. So here's an example: leopards under a little tree. I probably slightly overexposed the scene for the shadows that were there. But if we have a look at that histogram down over here, okay, that in the bottom right hand corner there, the histogram looks pretty good. Very easy. Look at that histogram. Yes, it's lacking a little bit of lights and it's lacking a little bit of darks and it doesn't have a full tonal range. But as a starting point, that histogram, very easy to look at it and say, right, there's an even tone all the way through, and it's almost got that perfect peak, almost sort of thing, because there's an equal amount of all the color tones and everything that are in here. So it's picking up all the tones that are coming through from the shadows under the tree, from the subjects themselves, from the grass in the background, from the light shining in the grass in the background. And it's saying, yes, this is all fairly evenly matched because the light was pretty good at this point in time. So a really nice scenario and a histogram that anyone would look at and say, yeah, that's pretty good, because the histogram that we've been programmed to try and look at and say, yes, with this histogram, and we are happy to carry on. Okay, and we carry on shooting and photographing the scene. Then we end up with a scene that may look like something like this, with really dark oranges in the background. Now look at that histogram. Okay, so when you look at the histogram, if we interpret that histogram, it's telling us that the vast majority of light is lying within our shadows and dark side of our histogram. Okay, so is that wrong? Is it right? So now remember, you've got to look at the image. You're going to say, well, hang on. What happens if I try and get this back to our perfect kind of histogram sort of area and move that peak from my shadowed areas right up until my mid-tone areas? What's going to happen to my subject? Because my subject's lying there with quite a bit of nice light on it. And she's probably about, let's say, 30% of the frame, maybe a little bit more, maybe 40% of the frame. So a lot of my frame is rather dark, which is what my histogram is telling me, but it doesn't make it wrong. If I was to try and correct this and pull that histogram up to what we perceive to be correctly right, my background might now be in the mid-tone sort of area, which is not really where we want it because it's dark. I want to keep it dark. But what's going to happen to my subject is that all that beautiful light that's on her face is now going to get blown out because that's also going to get brighter. So my background's going to get brighter and my subject's going to get brighter. So trying to get this histogram to go up to the top section is not necessarily what we're trying to do, or into our mid-tone section is not necessarily right. So that histogram is right for this photograph. Okay, so again, all comes down to interpreting what the histogram is telling you and not being stuck with this idea that your histogram always needs to be in the middle. The example is obviously very dark scene like this. So if we look at this histogram, it basically is telling us that this picture is black. There's nothing going on there. So it doesn't understand that there's an external light source that's been used. So I used a flash in order to capture this photograph, which is not going to be captured in the light meter reading that's then interpreted to our histogram by the camera. So camera is picking this up and saying, well, this is really, really bright. This is really dark, should I rather say, and it's way bright. So in scenarios where you are using an external light source, such as a spotlight at nighttime or a flash at nighttime, these kind of environments, there's just no ways that you could even remotely rely on a histogram at this point in time. So it's one of those times when you're photographing that you need to chuck your histogram out the window and ignore it completely, and almost try and trust as much as possible what you're capturing on your camera by looking at your screen. All right. Another example that we have over here is an elephant with a really bright background. All right. So here again, our camera is telling us, well, hang on, you're actually overexposing this in quite a dramatic way. However, yes, my sky is overexposed. Okay. And that is indicated in histogram. However, the subject of the elephant and the foreground and the tree are perfectly exposed. And I'm quite happy with that. So again, just another scenario where interpreting the histogram and understanding what it's telling you from a perspective of where the light is lying in the image that you've captured. Are you happy with that, or are you not happy with it? Obviously, if I was to try and bring this back now down and underexpose everything a little bit more, my subject's going to become really dark and almost silhouette-like, but then I'm going to end up with a really nice sky. In this sort of scenario, silhouette would work nicely. So obviously, to overexpose in order to get my subject really nicely well exposed. At the same time, blowing out the background, which I can see and I understand why my histogram is telling me that that is happening. And a final example, lion, very bright background. He's lying slightly in a shaded area on a very sandy road. The sand is this really bright soil as well. So having to overexpose quite dramatically to blow out that bright light behind him and just correctly expose those shadowed areas in the front. He's really nicely exposed. He's not overexposed. He's not losing detail in him, but the background is really blown out and everything like that. And the histogram is telling us that as well. So the histogram, as you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner, still nice subject. My subject is king, remember? That's the thing that I'm trying to expose for. So again, I understand what my histogram is telling me, and I can see where all the light is lying, and I agree with it, and I'm saying, yes, I'm happy with that. There's no issues going forward. All right. So this brings us now to, I hope everyone has a better understanding now of how to read a histogram and how to interpret it correctly. And not be fooled into thinking all the time that we need this perfect histogram or this perfect shape that's coming out there from a histogram perspective. This brings us now to what I would refer to as ultimate exposure and quality. And this is now taking more into consideration the technical details and construction of the internal elements of our camera rather than a technique perspective. Okay, so it will move on to technique, but for now, let's just talk about our the internal structure or the design of a sensor and how its sensor is built, actually, a digital sensor. So if we look at the top histogram that we have there with our black shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites, and then refer that back down to our bottom histogram that we have there, which reflects tonal levels within the sensor's structure and how it captures information. Okay, so a digital sensor has certain tonal ranges that it captures within each segment of that sensor. If you can break it down into a black shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites kind of scenario, much the same way as our histogram is displayed to us, the vast majority of dynamic range, and you've probably heard of a thing called dynamic range, and that is the amount of light that can be captured in a scene from the darkest point to the brightest point of that particular scene that you have in front of you. Now, certain cameras have higher dynamic ranges than others, and that's why for me specifically, as a wildlife photographer, I really love cameras that have a high dynamic range. It allows me to capture much higher amount of tones, much more accurately. So for example, the D850 that I photograph has nearly 15 stops of dynamic range. Okay. If you take into consideration that a person that has 20/20 vision sees 20 stops of dynamic range, and that's how we're able to see details in shadowed areas and details in highlighted areas. To have a camera that sees nearly 15 stops of dynamic range is very, very impressive. It's 3/4 of obviously what we can do in our brain with our brain processing capabilities. So for a camera to be able to do that is really, really impressive. But one of the important things to look at here is how that tonal range and how that dynamic range is split up within your sensor's structure, because it is far from equal. Okay, so the vast majority of the information that is captured from in a sensor, and we can refer this back to dynamic range, the vast majority of that information is in the highlights to light section of the sensor. So that more than 50%, in fact, almost 3/4 of the information that your sensor captures, is in the highlights to light section of the frame. So from the middle of the highlights going to the light side, that is more than 50% of the information, as you can see there in the tonal values. Okay, so 2048 tonal values and 1024 values and 512 tonal values just in the midtones to the light section. Whereas you can see how the tonal values drastically decrease when you start going to underexposed side of things. You start going to the shadows and dark side of a histogram. Okay, so now you're right down there, which means that if you're photographing dark images and trying to recover dark images, you are actually creating really big issues for yourself. Number one, you're going to probably create a lot more noise, okay, recovering from a dark side. Number two, you're losing dynamic range because there's less information in that section. You start a lot more detail, a lot less noise, and a lot more information that you're able to capture. Right, so let's show you this in a little bit more detail. So if we look at these images that we have here, and then the relative histograms above it. So obviously on the far left-hand side over here, we have an image that is very hectically, underexposed and the black clipped. And that's obviously something that you really want to avoid. You don't want to do that. If it's a once in a lifetime photograph and you have to recover it, then sure, obviously, a noisy photograph and a grainy photograph is better than no photograph whatsoever. But you want to avoid that by all means possible. Then the next one that we have going up over here is one that's the blacks aren't clipped, but that's very heavily in the shadows. And if you have a look at the relative photograph, you can see that that photograph is darker than what it probably should be. And our histogram is telling us that relative to this photograph, because it's a really nice, evenly lit photograph that you can see here. So you can really trust the histogram. In this middle image, again here, neutral exposure, nothing wrong with it. However, if you're photographing at a time of day where you are having to push that ISO a little bit, you're probably still going to end up with quite a bit of noise, depending on, up to what limits you're pushing your ISO levels. Okay. I'm going to skip this ultimate exposure one for now. I'm going to go to the bright one. This bright one on the far right-hand side here. Now, obviously, now this is blown out. It's clipped on the right-hand side, and now you've gone way too far, and you don't want to do that. Okay. So now remember, when you're clipping and you're losing that information, and you're clipping those highlights, you're losing that information. It's gone. It's never to come back ever again. Okay. So again, something you don't want to avoid. So something that you do want to avoid. However, in this section over here, all right, in the ultimate exposure section, this is where I am targeting a lot of the time. Okay. So I'm targeting an image that's probably slightly brighter than what it should be. Okay. But it's not blowing out any important information. I'm not blowing out any highlights. I'm capturing everything that's there. The picture is just slightly brighter than what it actually is. Why am I doing that? More detail, more sharpness, better color reproduction, and less noise if you're having to photograph at higher ISOs. First thing you would do when you process that photograph is drop the exposure slightly and bring it all back together again. Remember, you've now captured a lot more information, and even by dropping the exposure, you're not creating noise or anything like that because you still have a very clean image. Okay, a lot more information, a lot more detail, and a lot less noise. From a dark side, bringing it up, you're going to start creating noise for yourself. You really don't want to be doing that. Okay, it's something that you really just want to stay away from. So if we have a look at this and you say, so why shoot to the right? This whole concept is called shooting to the right. Okay, and the idea is to have your histogram slightly to the right. Again, if we go back to our little brainwashed idea of what a perfect histogram looks like, slightly to the right, okay? So an image that's slightly bright, okay, but not blowing out any highlights, okay? So why shoot to the right? More dynamic range because more tonal values are in that section. Less noise even at higher ISOs. So when you start getting to that point where you're really having to push your ISO quite a bit, overexpose even a little bit more, but be careful. You get more detail and better color reproduction because of all that information that has been stored in that section of your sensor. More information equals better quality images. Okay, it's that simple. But, very, 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 very important. Be careful not to blow out highlights. So I'm talking about an image that you need to overexpose slightly. Okay, this doesn't mean that you can also still underexpose with your exposure compensation and have an image that's slightly overexposed. And I hope now through the histograms and the images that I showed you, you understand now how that is possible. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go plus everything. It doesn't work that way. You may have an image that you've underexposed by minus a third, but the overall photograph is still slightly overexposed because in order to get it perfect, you would have needed to underexpose by, let's say, a full stop. Okay, so it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean to say that everything must be now immediately turn on your camera and put your camera on plus a third or plus 2/3. It doesn't work like that. Have to understand what your histogram is telling you and interpret it correctly, and just make sure that your image is slightly brighter than perfect, okay, or a neutral exposure, slightly brighter than what would a neutral exposure would be, and you will reap the benefits from it without a doubt. When I say you've got to be very careful about not blowing out your highlights, this is something that I use very, very, very regularly, and I almost look at this more regularly than what I do at my histogram. I rely on it a hell of a lot, and that is the little blinkies you may have heard it referred to, the highlight alert tones that you have in your camera. And there's two examples here showing you how to turn this on a Nikon and a Canon camera. So it's definitely something that I would recommend that everyone make sure they have on their cameras. Really, really important. It will, like in this photograph, I've displayed it as a red tone. Okay. However, in your camera, when you're reviewing your photograph and your highlight alert tone is on, it will flash black. Okay, so that little red area that we have indicated there would be flashing black, which would be indicating to me that that area is blowing out. Okay, so that is not something that we want to do. So you got to be very careful. That's indicating that now my image is too bright. I'm losing information in that area. That area on that particular bird is very important to me. If it was a white sky in the background and I'm blowing it out, but my subject is perfect, I would then interpret that blowing out area by the flashing black and say, all right, yes, that area is blown out, but it should be blown out because I'm exposing correctly for my subject. So I'm going to ignore the fact that it's blowing out, and be happy with the fact that it is blowing out in actual fact. Whereas in a scenario like this, I want detail in those feathers. I can't afford for those white areas in that bird to be blown out. So I need to underexpose a little bit more in order to get those white areas perfect and not blown out. Okay. Very, very important. Don't blow the highlights out. Here's an example of a leopard. Again, really dark background. Okay. So very, very easy to try and overcompensate and try and get that kind of perfect histogram that we, kind of trying to do if you put it that way. But by making that the dark background brighter, we're now losing out the bright areas on that leopard's chest and the chin and around her eyes. All those white areas are now blown out. So in order to get that right, we need to underexpose that in order to get those white areas correct and maintain our really nice dark background, which means our histogram is probably going to be heavily leaning to the left-hand side. However, it's still a correctly exposed photograph. And you can still expose it slightly brighter than what you normally would do without blowing out those highlights. Okay. Remember, you're still going to end up with a muddy photograph with an image that's slightly brighter and one that is darker that you have to then add exposure to. Rather drop exposure and have to add exposure. So thanks very much for joining, everyone. I hope that you've managed to learn something from this video. If you'd like to see any more of my webinars that are up and coming and my on-demand webinars, please do have a look at my link below, and enjoy the rest of your day.